today. Welcome all people on a botanical seminar, also the zoologists of our department. And we can warmly welcome Adam Thomas Clark. This presentation was planned, I think, 1 year ago, because Adam, he works in University of Graz, so we thought it will be great to invite Adam to Brno to discuss personally possibilities for cooperation. This is not the case because we are still closed, and probably somewhere in future we can welcome Adam in Brno. So Adam is ecologist, I guess. Mm-hmm. He studied coexistence of species in grassland, succession, ant communities also, and theoretical models. His CV is great. He finished master in Harvard, am I right? Then he worked in a group of David Tillman in Cedar Creek, long-term research in Minnesota. After that in Germany, Leipzig, Halle, and now in Graz, and now in Brno.
Yes, exactly, and I'm very excited.
Adam, please, can you start your presentation?
Yes, let's see. Can you see the right screen?
Yeah, we can.
Excellent. So again, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. I would ask if it gets hard to understand me or if I end up speaking too quickly, which is a thing I do very frequently. Please just break in and remind me that I should calm down a bit. But in any case, the overall
Sorry, before you will start, Milan has a question maybe.
Yeah?
Oh no, sorry. I hit
questions
the button.
There will be after the presentation.
Sorry, I will ask after the presentation. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, no problem though. Also, certainly feel free to break in with questions over the course of this. This is a pretty piecewise talk, so it won't get in the way of anything. And in fact, this is actually a good way to introduce it. Basically, this is a talk about a problem I've had. And so I've been trying for a while to find a method that lets me measure especially the stability of coexistence, but in general also just the stability of ecological communities with empirical data. And to sort of go through this, I'm going to have three basic chunks of this presentation. The first is going to sort of summarize existing work and goals and challenges related to that question. The middle piece is going to be introducing three existing methods that I think we can sort of weld together into a solution for those challenges. And then the very last section, I'll talk a bit about ways that I'm using this joint method right now. As the motivation, this is the landscape out here in Western Styria, where I live, just outside of Graz. This is the Koa-Alm region at about 1,800 meters. And I really like this particular area because it gives a nice example of where sort of disturbance and stability and ecology become very important. Here we're just a bit below the tree line, and you can actually see that here in that there's trees both above and below us, and we're in a pasture in the middle. And from this point, if you look up the mountain, you see a group of cows, and that's why this area is clear. It's a pasture and is grazed. And if you look left from that point, you see a little stream running down the mountain. And there's these great wildflower communities growing here. Here are orchids in the early summer. And the important thing here is that if we didn't have the cattle grazing this particular spot, this would be a forest. And you can even see here a couple of oak trees doing their best to make their way into the community. And so I have spent a lot of time in these sorts of in-between systems that require a certain amount of disturbance to maintain them, but of course also require sufficiently non-intensive management strategies that they don't just get totally overrun into something like an overused pasture landscape. So this is the area around where I live now, but it's very similar processes take place in the area where I worked for my graduate degree. And so this is a picture taken just over the northern half of the Cedar Creek Reserve in Minnesota. where I did my PhD work. And I work primarily in these patches here, these open areas. These are a series of old fields in the area. This part of the reserve tends towards forest. There are a few regions in the southern half that are more savanna that seem to have been maintained through burning for basically since the last ice ages. But the fields on the north half really are only there because they were agricultural fields sometime in the last 100 years and were subsequently abandoned. And that sort of makes sense for this part of the world. So Minnesota sits right at this edge between, on the eastern side, these large deciduous forests of North America, and on the west side, the large steppe going out into the Great Plains. And in this particular part, you're a bit more over into the forested end. I'm primarily a theoretical ecologist, so of course the way that I encountered these fields when I wasn't collecting data was mostly looking at plots like this. So this is for those fields, some time series data showing how biodiversity and productivity changed over the course of succession. So here the horizontal axis shows the age of the fields, effectively in years since the field was abandoned. And this is a space for time substitution. So the fields have been surveyed for about 30 years, but because they've been abandoned in a staggered fashion, some of them are newly abandoned and some were abandoned almost a century ago. The 100% line here is showing the diversity and productivity in nearby savanna remnants, which is less important for what I want to talk about here, but sort of the clear pattern that anyone who's worked in a successional system before knows is that change is the norm. And so the black lines here show the average trend seen across all fields. And for the question of stability and maintenance in these systems, I would argue the much more important component is the fact that there's also a lot of variability among fields. So each of the colored lines here shows dynamics taken on average across a single field. And you'll see not only do the fields differ a lot from each other in terms of the trajectories they follow, but there's also obviously a lot of difference over time within a single field. And this raises the question of how you could actually go about purposefully trying to guide one of these systems. And so if my goal is to have high productivity because I want a pasture, or my goal is to have high diversity or to maintain a particular subset of species for conservation interest, it's clear that it's not entirely straightforward to pick a single trajectory and get yourself onto it to make sure that over the next 100 years, the field will take on the characteristics that you'd like it to see. And this sort of loosely goes into this wider idea of ecological stability, and it's often described as this ball and cup model, where you have an attractor, which is a region across which dynamics will be pulled into a single point, and these systems are described in terms of their resistance or resilience, so how they respond to a disturbance and how quickly they recover from it. And for systems where people think about alternate stable states, we also talk often about a basin of attraction, so a region where we would imagine disturbances aren't sufficiently large to drive you into some other regime beyond what you've already seen before. And in theory, this seems like a really nice framework. So we ought to be able to take one of these fields, figure out how the field responds to different kinds of perturbations, decide what endpoint we would like the field to reach, and then somehow find a management plan that gets us towards that point. But in practice, again, things turn out to be a bit more complicated. And just to illustrate this, here's an example of the same data set, but I've broken it apart into 3 species groups. So on the left, this is just showing what they are as annuals, C3 photosynthetic pathway, so cool season grasses, and C4 grasses. The annuals are things that sort of anyone who's worked in agricultural fields knows, things like Ambrosia artemisifolia or erigeron. And these, of course, come in quite early in succession and very quickly disappear. The C3 grasses in Cedar Creek tend to mostly be species that have come in from Europe over the last few hundred years. And across the successional time series, as you see right here, these tend to increase in abundance for sort of the first 50 years and then slowly begin to be pushed out of the system again. And then finally, for these dominant bunch grasses, these are the tall grasses that sort of give the prairie feel to these regions. And those tend to come in very slowly, but increase in abundance over succession, such that in the oldest fields, they're by far the most dominant species. And so if we try to convert this into a sort of simple binary metric of stable or not stable systems, we get what you see on the right. And so this is a metric based on invasion rate, but basically the way you can look at it is to say everywhere that's blue is a measurement that suggests that these dynamics are consistent with these species groups maintaining stable abundances over time. And anywhere where it's red, this would suggest that their dynamics are not consistent with maintaining stable abundances over time. And these axes show different extents of data. So as we move back and forth across the horizontal axis, we're including shorter or longer temporal extents of the successional time series. And if we move up and down the vertical axis, we're including different spatial extents. So literally, how many square meters are we including in our survey? And if we were to look at a snapshot just at the very beginning of the time series, we would have concluded that the annuals are becoming dominant in the system and that the C3 and C4 grasses were unable to establish. If we were to look at the middle of the time series, we would have seen that annuals are beginning to be driven out. The C3 grasses are dominant and the C4 grasses are unable to establish. And finally, if we were to look at the end of this time series, we would find the annuals are completely unable to persist. And the C3 and C4 grasses both have sets of dynamics that would be consistent with their long-term persistence in the system. And this sort of illustrates the problem we have when we want to try to pick a trajectory that's going to take us to desired endpoint, was we always have these little snapshots in space and time. And without a really holistic view of a system, it's very hard to use past performance of a system to make guesses about what's likely to happen in the future. And I would argue this is a pretty general problem in ecology. So just to caricature this, depending on the size of the organism or the rates of its own life history dynamics, in cases like A, it might be that even the finest grain, fastest sampling we can do is still averaging across thousands or millions of individuals. And the dynamics happen so quickly that we can't really even watch transitions. We just see these jumps between different states. Whereas for other species groups like trees, often even when we have huge surveys, we still only have a couple thousand individuals. And the dynamics can be so slow that you effectively aren't able to measure any change at all. And so I would say for the most part, except for very few systems, we tend to be stuck only being able to observe a very small fraction of the full dynamics a system could take on. And so this is what leads us sort of to the central question that I want to talk about here, which is given that we know that ecological systems are complex and our ability to estimate their stability is going to be very dependent on context, how can we go about finding a way to effectively monitor, manage, and forecast the kinds of behavior we expect in those systems? So for example, how can we say with any certainty how long before this particular species is likely to go extinct, or what's likely to happen if I reduce the size of this reserve by some amount? And on top of that, in particular, I think it's important to see if we can come up with a very general tool for doing this, because of course, really detailed site-specific studies can go about answering these questions with pretty high confidence. And that's, I think, one of the great things that's happened at Cedar Creek, where I've done a lot of my work. That area has been studied intensively for 30 years, and I think we have a pretty good handle on how that system is likely to change in the future. But we can't do that for every single system on Earth. And so that's sort of the call that I want to push here, to have a general method that we can apply in most places. And then the last piece is I think it's going to be very important that however these methods work, we're able to link them to existing theoretical frameworks relating to ecological change. And that's because there is a lot of really interesting existing theory and a lot of existing toolkits that we could benefit from, but I think often these tend to be very hard to actually apply under any empirical context. So these are 3 goals. Find a way to effectively predict how systems are likely to change, find a way to do it generally across lots of systems, and find a way to link these estimates to existing frameworks. And I'm now actually just going to jump into a discussion of 3 different types of methods that I think we can combine in order to help answer this question. And the first of this is going to be Taylor's power law. And I actually have to give special thanks to Peter here. He was the one who sort of got me started on the whole trajectory that I'm going to talk about in this project. And we were in a lab meeting at some point, and he sort of thought in relation to a statistical problem that someone was having, that it might be possible to use the Taylor power law as sort of a statistical correction. So a way to correct for some artifacts in the data that might otherwise be hard to handle. And I thought this was a really interesting idea. And so for those of you who might not be familiar with this, the Taylor power law is effectively a very commonly observed pattern that shows a link between mean abundance and the variance of abundances in time series data. And so here, for example, are some of the data that Taylor presented in their paper in Nature in 1961, where they sort of proposed this notion. And the law states that the relationship between, like I said, the mean here, so this would be the average abundance of something measured through time, can be related to the variance in that abundance through time following this kind of a function, where C and Z are both fitted constants. And if we do this in log space, and that's how this is plotted here, this tells us that the log of the variance is equal to some constant plus a slope Z times the log of the mean abundance. And that's how we get each of these lines here. These are all different fitted versions of this function for different communities. An important aspect of this law is it turns out to be incredibly widely observable. And so these are just some data from various studies that test insect populations, gene distributions, stock dynamics, bird dynamics, and traffic flow patterns. And across all these different kinds of patterns, not only do you tend to find this pattern of this log linear relationship between the mean and the variance, but it also tends to be very, very strong. So if you calculate an R² across these, it's often upwards of 90%, which is unheard of for most ecological data sets. And just to give you a sense of how we would go about measuring this, so here's our landscape again up on the Kua'aim here. And if we were to set out a bunch of plots across the landscape and measure them every year, let's say we're just measuring total biomass of herbaceous plants. For each of these plots, we would have a time series. From each of those time series, we could measure a mean. And then based on the variability in that time series over time, we could also estimate a variance. And just to show you some data from my own work, here are the mean versus variances over time for Schizochyrium scoparium, so little blue stem dynamics across the Cedar Creek Reserve. And this isn't a data set I picked because it fits especially well. It actually fits especially poorly compared to a lot of the other species you could look at. But this was just the first one that I pulled out to do this analysis on. And so this shows this is a very nicely conserved pattern for pretty much any data set that you want to apply it to. There are a lot of interpretations for what this pattern means or why it should be there, but one of the simplest, I'm just going to show as an example here, is related to how variance groups across different subsets. So let's imagine we have some variable like x, which could describe abundance over time. That variable x, that abundance, has some mean value, which I'll have here as mu naught, and some variance, which is sigma naught, if we observe it at the level of a single plot. So the mean and variance of abundance in a plot are going to be mu naught and sigma naught. If we want to know the sum of the abundance across all these plots, we can simply take A times the mean plot level abundance, where A is the sampling time or number of plots or whatever index it is that we're summing across here. And that should make sense. If I know that M naught is the average abundance across all these plots, then if I multiply the average abundance by the number of plots, I get the average abundance across all plots. It turns out you can do the same thing for variance. So if we assume that the plots have totally independent dynamics, so if one plot happens to have high abundance one year, that has no impact on what the other plots happen to be doing. Under those circumstances, variance acts exactly the same way. If I want to know the expected variance of the summed biomass across all the plots, I can just sum up the individual plot level variances, meaning I end up with A times the variance at the plot level. And if we were to turn this into if we were to convert this into the form for the power law, for this case here, that would give us a slope for the relationship between the mean and variance in log space of 1. So if there's no correlation at all between patches, we expect a slope of 1. In contrast, if the plots are perfectly correlated, so that's to say if one plot has a high biomass one year, we expect all the other plots to also have a high biomass. In that case, we would just sum up A times the plot level abundance, which in variance scaling leads to an increase in variance of A squared times the plot level variance. And if we convert that into the power law, we're given a slope of 2. So slope of 1 means no correlation among plots. Slope of 2 means perfect correlation among plots. And if we draw this in over the data for Schizocerium, we find this. So if it had had a slope of 1, the line would have been down here. If it had had a slope of 2, it would have been up here. And the actual slope we see is pretty darn close to 2. So I guess that would mean we could say these data would suggest that Schizocerium dynamics are relatively strongly correlated, since they're more like the slope of 2 than they are like the slope of 1. The problem is, like everything, it's more complicated than that. And so this is the distribution of slope values from Taylor's original paper. And you'll notice 5% of the data have slopes that are less than 1, which would mean that they were less correlated than perfectly uncorrelated. And 20% of the data sets had slopes of greater than 2, which would mean they were more correlated than perfectly correlated. So clearly, the statistical explanation doesn't totally get us the patterns that we see in the real world. And indeed, this has been picked up and studied in lots of other fields now. I should say that Taylor power law is one of the few cases we have where ecology invented new math that physicists and mathematicians took up later. And so following the Taylor law studies, physicists, of course, renamed it Tweedy models because I think they were upset that they hadn't come up with it themselves. And so there are now interesting studies that show effectively across lots of different types of statistical distributions the range of scaling coefficients that you can expect. So here what they label P is what I've called Z in the previous slides. And this just basically shows, depending on what type of process you're tracking, you basically can get any scaling coefficient ranging from 0 all the way up to infinity. And this has sort of led to a bit of a bonanza in the literature. And so here, just as examples of mechanisms that have been purported to explain the Taylor power law, we have Taylor's original paper where they explain that they think this is an indication of how species aggregate in space. There have been subsequent papers that suggest it's a sign of temporal synchrony. There are other papers that have suggested that it's indicative of fractal structure in populations, others that have linked it with species interactions, and some that have suggested it's just a statistical artifact, so a pattern that must arise in real-world data. And that's actually what brought me to my dragon. And this, I think, was on the poster, and this just shows the number of citations including the phrase Taylor power law and ecology in Web of Science over time. And what you'll see is, I think, quite uniquely among research topics, not only has the citation count slowed in recent years, but it's in fact dropped. In that year by year now, fewer and fewer papers are publishing on this topic. And to me, and that's why we have the dragon. See how this pattern sort of looks like a dragon? I thought this is a theoretical talk, so you have to try something to make it a little bit more exciting. So this is our dragon, and he's going to be following us for the remainder of the presentation whenever we run into trouble. But to me, this indicates that there's a lot of excitement around this idea that this might be a sort of a holy grail that could solve a lot of issues in ecology. But now that it's become clear that this is sort of a pattern that can't be used to isolate individual mechanisms, a lot of that excitement has died down. And drawing from Peter's comment that I showed at the beginning, I think in some ways we maybe should rethink how we want to apply this metric, in that even if it doesn't tell us what an underlying mechanism is, it still could be a useful statistical pattern. Sort of in the same way that if you know that data are normally distributed, that allows you to do lots of nice statistical tricks with it. But the fact that my data happen to be normally distributed doesn't necessarily tell me what process generated that data. And so we're going to leverage this pattern as a common statistical feature, but we're not going to try to use it to predict anything about the underlying processes that generated our data. And so just as a quick summary here, the Taylor power law is a very general pattern between the mean and variance. The slope of the power law, Z, summarizes how variance changes with abundance. And there are lots of different types of processes and mechanisms that can give us effectively the same Z values. So next, we're going to jump into our second method, which is the coefficient of variation. And coefficient of variation, or CV, is a quite common empirical metric used in ecological studies of stability. And all it is this standard deviation term, so the square root of variance, divided by the mean, usually calculated from time series data. So mu, again, here would be the average abundance over time for a species in a plot, and sigma would be the standard deviation of that abundance over time. And so if CV equals 1, that means the standard deviation is equal to the mean. If CV is 2, it means the standard deviation is twice the mean, and so on. And if in general it's interpreted as meaning that when the CV gets larger, the system gets more variable relative to the mean and therefore less stable. And just as a side note, this will often actually get reported in reverse as invariability, which is just 1 over CV squared. As it turns out to show up in a couple more mathematical frameworks as a convenient formulation of CV. And for invariability, it's just the opposite. As invariability gets larger, the system gets less variable relative to the mean, and therefore is interpreted as being more stable. And just some examples of how this might look. So here we have time series data with different means and different standard deviations. And here, because even though the mean is 10 times larger, the standard deviation is also 10 times larger. And so you end up with the same CV and same pattern down here. So again, a 10-fold increase in mean. In this case, a 10-fold increase in standard deviation. But here the standard deviation is twice the size of the first example. And so the CV is the same between these two, but is twice as high as these two. So just sort of a bookkeeping game for calculating CV. In general, when people use CV in studies, it's used as a qualitative measure. So you might calculate it for a lot of different plots or species and use the relative values to say how stable A is relative to B. But in general, you can't use it as an absolute measure. So I can't look at CV and use that to say how long a particular set of species are likely to coexist, or even to say in absolute terms, how is this system stable or not. Another issue, which I'll talk about later, is that CV actually can conflate a lot of different sources of variation, but I'll talk about that in a bit. The main reason I'm bringing this up is that there have been a couple of very important theoretical developments related to CV, which I think are especially exciting for studies of stability. The first is drawn from stochastic dynamical systems theory. There's a series of papers by Jeff Arnaldi starting around 2016. They've been sort of coming out regularly ever since. And they relate lots of different aspects of variability in systems, but this is a pretty consistent finding across them. This notion that we can relate empirical measurements of CV, so this thing that we can go out and measure in the field, to an estimate of some of the more complex properties of a system. So here, sigma D is the variability in the effects of perturbations on abundance. So this isn't the variability in abundance, but rather the variability that's caused by disturbances. So how much biomass do I lose on average given a severe drought? And R is, in this case, the recovery rate. So how quickly do I recover from a disturbance? And for a relatively wide range of systems, roughly speaking, my CV can be related to these variables following this function, which means that if my CV is low, that could either be because perturbations are weak, so this term is small, or it could be because recovery is fast, R is high, and that should make sense. Ways that I can keep my system from fluctuating very much are either that it never gets hit very hard or that it recovers very quickly after being hit by a perturbation. For this particular form, there's some pretty strong assumptions that we have to make. The most important here are that the system has to be stationary. So there's a fixed point equilibrium that abundances are always drawn back to, something like a carrying capacity. We also have to assume that dynamics are linear, which effectively means that the return rates are going to be consistent no matter what part of the abundance space I'm in. And there's also derived for white noise perturbations, in this case, basically normally distributed disturbances around some mean. And we'll talk about getting around those in a minute, but that's sort of where this sits right now. The other finding has been some really neat attempts to show how you can use CV to extrapolate stability across scales. And so this is a figure from a paper by Xiaopeng Wang in Nature, not Nature, Ecology and Evolution, in Nature Communications in 2017, showing how invariability, so this inverse metric of CV, varies across different spatial scales for forest data sets. And the basic idea behind this is that you can use some pretty low-level features of how variance groups, so similar to these patterns I was showing you before that give you these slopes of 1 and 2. You can leverage similar patterns to guess how CV is likely to change across different subsets of data. And so if A is some large subset of sites that I want to consider, and rho is the average correlation in abundances among those sites, then I can guess the amount of the invariability or the coefficient of variance at a particular scale following this pretty simple function. And for the most part, as long as you actually have data from all sites, so if I know actually what A is and I've measured rho correctly, this formula pretty much has to hold. It's a tautological relationship for these kinds of data sets. And we can actually do something quite similar using the Taylor-Power law. So remember, the Taylor-Power law relates variance and mean following this function, and our CV is the standard deviation divided by the mean. And so we can plug the Taylor-Power law into this, effectively replace the sigma here with C times mu to the Z. And if we solve that out, we end up with this scaling relationship. So effectively, the ratio in CVs, so what's the change in stability at some scale A relative to some reference scale 0, should be predictable following this relationship. So A raised to a power of Z minus 2. And this actually is helpful because it gives us a testable hypothesis for this scaling function. Namely, if Z is less than 2, then this exponent would be negative. So we'd have a number less than 2 minus 2, meaning the system would become more stable at larger scales. If Z is greater than 2, we expect the opposite. This exponent becomes positive, and so we expect the system to become less stable at larger scales. And if Z equals 2, then we expect no change. This exponent drops away, and we just scale in terms of area. So here's a testable prediction that we can make based on this fusion of the Taylor-Power law and of these insights about coefficient of variation. And I'm actually going to leave our discussion of CV here and move on to one last step. But just as a summary quickly, CV is a common metric for summarizing stability based on this relationship between mean and variance. There have been some recent developments that help us link CV both to the Taylor-Power law and also to theoretically relevant metrics of stability. But one thing that we're going to have to get around is that a lot of these insights are limited to relatively simple systems, and in particular, stationary systems, meaning that we can't have systems that oscillate in abundances through time or something like that. And so that's why our dragon has visited us again, because this is a problem that we will have to overcome. Finally, to bring us into the third method, I'm going to talk about stochastic filtering methods here. But first, I'm actually going to lead with the problem that we left with in CV. Namely that it tends to conflate several different sources of variability. And there are lots of ways you can divide this out, but I think one of the simplest is to divide it into 3 pools. The first at the top is observation error. So that's differences between an abundance and my observation of that abundance, just because my measurements aren't perfect. The second is actual system dynamics. So that might be something like predator-prey oscillations, which can lead to changes in abundance over time, but might not actually directly be indicative of stability in a system. And the third would be actual stochastic variation, so process noise. And these would be things that really lead to wiggling around whatever the deterministic trend might have been. And that, I think, I would argue is the thing that's closest to what we would imagine disturbances do to a real ecological system. And so this sort of begs the question, how can we actually go about separating out these different types of variability? And just because I think it's worth explaining why I especially think that dynamical variability can be an issue, this is a really neat paper that came out in Nature in 2019. And as far as I know, this is the longest term data on predator-prey oscillations that's ever been collected. This was done by a group at Oldenburg in Germany, based on microcosm data. And here the red line shows oscillations for a predator species, and the green line shows oscillations for prey species. The really important thing that they showed, and this is one of lots of different tests they did to explain why this was the case, they showed that these oscillatory dynamics are not only ones that don't lead to extinction, so that is, the species are able to persist, they also are stable in and of themselves. And so if we track the period length, so how long it takes an oscillatory cycle to happen, and we watch that through time, we find that the system gets drawn towards a fixed period. So here, the red band here is showing the most, the period that dominates in this system. And there are these periods in time where we lose that oscillatory cycle. So here, for example, the two species are briefly out of phase, but the system is then drawn back in to this original oscillatory period of between 4 and 8 days. And it loses it again for a moment, and then is drawn back in, and loses it for a moment, and is then drawn back in. And so they use this to argue that this oscillatory period is stable, and that if I were to push the system out of that oscillation, it would draw itself back into it over time. And the main reason I'm showing this is just to argue, just because a system is non-stationary, so just because we see abundances changing over time, doesn't mean that it's not, that the system isn't stable. In fact, you can have all kinds of oscillatory dynamics that are entirely consistent with either long-term persistence or even stability, in the sense that that pattern will reassert itself after a disturbance. And so if we were to just measure the system naively and assume that all of this contributed to this coefficient of variation metric, we might vastly underestimate the stability of systems like this. So now we get around to how we would actually separate these out. And one of the most common ways for doing that in ecological data is to use something called a state space model. And these are pretty simple, that you basically break the system into 2 states, an observable variable, y, so that's just your observations through time, and then a latent variable, x, which describes the hypothetical true state of the system. So what you would have measured if you had perfect measurements of the system. And so you can't observe it, but you can try to model it. And the system then sort of proceeds like this. So we just assume that for every time step, I ought to be able to predict the true value at time t+1 based on some function of the previous true value plus w, which represents process noise here, so stochastic fluctuations that influence dynamics. And similarly, I should be able to estimate my observation, y at time t+1, as some function of the true value plus v, where v is a stochastic function representing observation error. So this doesn't influence dynamics, but it does influence my observation of those dynamics. Already, though, sort of the trick here should be evident, in that to apply something like this, we need to know f of x. So we need to be able to come up with a function that will reliably tell us what the abundance of a species would be in one time step, given its abundance currently. And obviously, there are a lot of people who spent a lot of time trying to come up with models like this for particular systems. But if we want to come up with a general approach that we can apply even in places where we don't know a lot about the system, we're sort of stuck here. We would need to somehow come up with a function f of x of t before we could separate out these sources of variance. And to overcome this, we're going to draw on one last piece of theory based on Tachan's theorem. And so Tachan's theorem is a really, I would argue, exceedingly important mathematical insight proposed by Floris Tachans, which effectively states that the future states of a dynamical system are predictable based on its past behavior. And I'll show some examples of this in just a minute. But in some ways, it's basically a semi-mechanistic form of modeling, in that it's using lagged observations of previous behavior of the system to try to generate a proxy for what the dynamics look like over time, and then it resamples from those historical dynamics in order to make predictions about future dynamics. And for our purposes, the important part is that it is guaranteed to predict to correctly predict future states of a system given an infinitely large training data set. So if we had an infinite amount of data about the past states of a system, we could always perfectly predict its next state. And in practice, if we have a reasonably large amount of data about the past states of a system, we can make pretty good predictions about its next state. And this is with no other information about how that system works. To sort of give you a feel for how this works, let's imagine we have, again, predator-prey oscillations. Here, the black line shows prey dynamics and the red line shows predator dynamics. And if I told you that the abundance was 5 right now of the prey species, just knowing that the abundance of 5 isn't enough to be able to predict what the next abundance is going to be. Because if the current abundance is 5, well, the next abundance could either be higher than the current abundance is, or it could be lower than the current abundance is. And without additional information, I don't know which of these two states I'm likely to be in. But if you tell me not only that the current state is 5, but you also tell me what the predator abundance is, well, then I can forecast dynamics. Because if predator abundance is high, then I know that in the next time step, the prey abundance is going to decline. Whereas if predator abundance is low, then I know in the next step, the prey abundance is going to increase. And that sort of makes some sense too. If predators are common, then prey should begin to decline in abundance. And if predators are rare, then prey should begin to increase. The important insight from Taken's theorem is that we don't actually need to know anything about the predator dynamics in order to predict prey dynamics. And that's because just like we can use information about what the prey population is, we can actually also use information about what the predator population is. We can also use information about what the prey population was in the last time step. And so for this simple example, if my current abundance is 5, and in the previous time step, the prey abundance was higher than it is now, then I know that I'm in a downward cycle. Whereas if the abundance is 5 and the previous abundance was lower than that, then I know that I'm in an upwards cycle. And this is a caricature, but the nice thing is this actually works out in higher dimensional systems as well. So even if I have lots of interacting species, in theory, I ought to be able to make predictions about how a particular species dynamics are likely to unfold in the future based only on its own historical dynamics. So without needing to observe everything else in the system. And in practice, this obviously gets harder and harder as systems get bigger and more complicated. Putting this all together, there are in fact existing methods that merge these two. And so the simple idea would be that we take this f of x function that we need in order to predict deterministically what abundances would be in the next time step. So this is the thing we need for that state space model. And we replace that with this Taken's algorithm, this delay embedding method. And this, for example, is an example from Franz Hamilton of what he called a Kalman-Takens filter. So it's using a Kalman filter, which is a type of state space model, and replacing this deterministic function with a Takens delay embedding method. And this sort of gives you a good example of how well this tends to work. So here the black line are the true abundances of a simulation here over time. The green points are observations, noisy observations around that. And then the red line shows what was reconstructed by this algorithm. So effectively, what has happened when we take these noisy abundances and try to recreate the true underlying dynamics. You see here, it does a quite good job. The sort of important thing about this is that you can sort of think of this as detrending the system. And so we can now treat each point on this red line as being effectively the central point of a fixed point equilibrium. And so even though in theory, a lot of the nice things that we could do using CV to relate variability to stability requires that our system is stationary, by using a metric like this, we can effectively treat every point in time as though it were a stationary system. And the assumption then is that if I were to knock the system away from a particular point, I would be drawn back towards the point predicted from this filter. So in effect, we can take that really simple ball and cup diagram from the beginning of the talk and shove it into this time series after effectively detrending out whatever the effects of deterministic variability might be. So we're now just asking, how much does the system get pushed away from the trend that would have been predicted based on its historical dynamics? Like I said, a series of papers have shown how to do this from applications that Franz Hamilton did. I would say his most accessible paper by far is the one in PLOS Computational Biology that I cited on the previous slide. One disadvantage of that method, though, is that it does rely on a Kalman filter. So Kalman filters are very fast approaches for doing state space fitting. The downside, though, is they're limited to quite simple error distributions. So remember, I had said one of the problems for these theories relating CV to stability is that we assume white noise perturbations, and that's effectively the same assumption that's baked into a Kalman filter. You mostly have to assume that your observation error and process noise functions are simple normal distributions. There is a way around this using a slightly more complicated method called particle filtering, and that would allow you to simulate a system with sort of arbitrary effects of any error distribution you want. So in this case, we could, for example, shove the Taylor power law in as the process noise function. But as far as I know, those sorts of methods haven't actually been developed yet. And so to give us our summary here, state space methods would let us separate out different things that have contributed to variability in a system. There are non-parametric methods that let us get around the problem of needing to know the process that generated the dynamics that we're looking at. But for the time being, existing implementations of these methods tend to be limited to pretty simple systems. And so that brings us now to the synthesis section. And maybe unsurprisingly, what I've done is try to implement a particle filter version of the Kalman-Takens filter. Effectively, it's going to combine these three sources of methods. We're going to leverage the Taylor power law as a very general pattern relating the mean and variance of abundance fluctuations. We're going to draw on insight from this coefficient of variation relation to stability indices and to aspects of stability that we can generalize across scales. And we're going to apply these stochastic filters, in this case based on a particle filter, in order to segregate out just the sources of variance that we think are actually relevant for stability in a system. And in this case, I'm just calling this a particle Takens filter out of deference to the filter from Franz Hamilton, since this is effectively just a copy of that filter with slightly more complicated components. And for what I'm going to show you here, I'm going to apply an observation error function that's just a fixed fraction of an observation. And so, for example, we'll say observation error is always about 10% of whatever the current abundance is. So if the abundance is large, observation error will be larger than if the abundance is small. And the process noise function, so the actual stochastic fluctuations that describe how abundances are sort of wiggle over time, is going to follow a Taylor power law. So the variance of the process noise function will equal a function that looks like this. So some constant times the abundance in whatever time step we're in raised to a power z. And to give you a sense of how this looks, again, here we have a black line that shows the true values of a simulated process. The yellow dots here show noisy observations around that trend. And this shows how we would go about actually fitting it. So here we take abundances observed over 3 time steps. Here's the abundance at time t, the abundance at t-1, and the abundance at t-2. The gray line shows literally how this process here, the orange line, the orange points here, so the noisy observations, how those vary over time. And the black circle shows the average across those observations. And that's what we're going to use to make predictions. In this case, it's a circle just because this here is a noisy sine wave, and a noisy sine wave in state space gives you a circle. But for more complicated processes, you would still get an average shape that would look like something. And if we use this to predict dynamics, we end up with this. So here are the true abundances, and here are the predictions from this method. And you'll notice they match pretty well, but they're not perfect. And that's because we have not yet accounted for observation error effects or process noise effects. And to do that, we finally run everything through this particle filter. And effectively, what the particle filter does is we simulate a swarm of possible states. So here the blue line is showing the average predictions from the particle filter. And for this last step, we're just going to show how the particles actually look. So we simulate a swarm of potential states that the system might take. And then across each of these particle estimates, we calculate two different probability distributions. Here in orange is the probability of each of these predictions given the observation. So effectively, and it's actually backwards, I should say. So it's the likelihood of the observation given each of these predictions. In blue, we have the likelihood of each of these particle estimates based on the previous abundance. So effectively, how likely am I to get to each of these states based on what the abundance was in the last time step? And in gray, we have the average between the two. And so what this algorithm basically does is it balances the information we have in the state that we observe versus the information we have in what states are likely to have existed based on the dynamics that the system can have. And we then end up making an estimate that falls between the two of those. And then we carry that out through time. And maybe the most important thing we can do once we've done this is that we can relate this now to some aspects of stability that we might really care about in our system. So this is just showing from this filter our estimates of what disturbances have done to the process through time. So again, the black line are the true dynamics, and the blue shaded region and these green points show what we think disturbances have done to the system. So here, each of these green points show what the abundance would have been had there been no perturbation. And here we see, for example, that from time point 33 to 34, if there had been no perturbation, the system would be at some relatively low abundance, but because there was a perturbation, the system was driven extinct. So this is effectively a case where our model suggests that there was an extinction event due to stochastic perturbations. And we can pull this information out to get an idea of how likely extinction events like this are across different abundances. So here on the x-axis are abundances in the simulation. In green is the standard deviation of the process noise function. This we just calculate from the fitted Taylor power law function. And in brown, we have the probability of a mortality event being driven by disturbances. And that just sort of makes sense. As the standard deviation of the process noise function gets large, we have a high probability of extinction. But as the abundance grows, that begins to reduce the probability of extinction. And the way those play out is sort of like this. So here again, we have abundance, we have the strength of process noise, and here in the contour plot in the back shows I'm showing the likelihood of an extinction event taking place over the next time step. So down here, extinction is very unlikely, and up here, extinction is very likely, which should make sense. If my abundance is high and process noise is small, it's very unlikely to lead to an extinction event. But if abundance is low and process noise is high, then it's very likely to lead to an extinction event. And we get back this prediction we had at the beginning about scaling coefficients. So these here again are the z values from our Taylor power law. If the z value is less than 2, then as abundance increases, the standard deviation of our process noise function increases as well, but more slowly than abundance does. So as abundance goes up, the likelihood of an extinction event actually drops through time. Whereas if the scaling coefficient is greater than 2, then the opposite happens. As abundance increases, process noise increases disproportionately quickly, and we end up increasing the likelihood of an extinction event as the system becomes more abundant. And this demonstrates sort of the most important outcome of this whole framework, which is, unsurprisingly, the probability that something goes extinct is going to depend on the intercept term, so effectively how big is the process noise for a small abundance, the z term, how quickly does it grow as a function of abundance, and also the abundance distribution itself. Because even if we're on this curve here, so long as the abundances are always relatively low, we actually will always have a very low risk of extinction according to this model. So anyway, this is sort of the information that we get out of this fitting process and that we can apply to real world data. And finally, to show us how this looks for real world data, here's an analysis of some time series data from a paper by Bergmer and Hillebrand, published in Oikos about 10 years ago. Here at the top are predictions from this particle filter for what the abundances were. So these are estimates of the true abundances, not the noisy observations of those abundances. And these three panels show our estimates for the stochastic functions. So these are estimates for the observation error function. This is the estimate for the C term in the process noise function. And probably most importantly, these are the estimates for the slope term, the Z, for the Taylor power law. And what you see here on the for this system here, this was a system with low variability in temperature as part of the experiment. And this was a system of high variability in temperature as part of the experiment. And you see in the system with high variability, eventually the species are driven extinct. And we can combine this information we have about the abundances with this information that we have about process noise and use that to predict how the likelihood of an extinction event changes over time. So this is the per time step likelihood of a species being driven extinct. And this down here is the estimated time to extinction for each of these populations. And so here, this population goes extinct faster, has a higher extinction rate, and therefore has a lower predicted time to extinction. And in some ways that should make sense, because this is also the system where we have a scaling coefficient that's closer to 2, which would tell us that as the system becomes more abundant, it also becomes less stable, which means it's pretty hard for that system to persist through time, because if it becomes too abundant, it will destabilize itself. So this is sort of what you get out the back of this function when you apply it. For anyone who's interested, this is available as an R package. It's up on GitHub. I promise I'll put out at some point soon a preprint describing how the package works. But the start of the semester has been a bit crazier than I thought it would be. So it should be up in a few months. And we're also working on a few applications of these methods. And so just for the last 2 or 3 minutes, this is a presentation I think Peter may have even discussed when he was here, but the general aim is to analyze how landscape and ecological changes along the Czech-Austrian border vary across different regions. And in particular, we want to ask if we can apply the kinds of tools that I described in this talk to estimate how community stability, diversity, and productivity in grasslands in that region have been influenced by the history of those landscapes. So among other things, how they've been influenced by the area of these landscapes, the management methods that are used there, and the age of these landscapes. So effectively, how long have they been under a consistent type of management? Like I said, this is a project that's being co-led by Peter Kiel, and also in collaboration, I should say, with a group at Vukoc, including Hanna Skokanova. And I think actually we got in touch with them because Milan pointed us in their direction, and that was exceedingly helpful. I'll show in a slide the data that we're getting from them. But this is an application that we've submitted as a joint project between Austria and the Czech Republic. And we're also hoping to be able to align this with the resurvey initiative that's coming out of EVA. And so just as a general plug, I think this is a super exciting opportunity to get some time series data across Europe. And so we're very much hoping that we can contribute some data to that initiative as part of this study. And to show what we're planning on doing, this is just a picture of the Austrian-Czech border, right, I guess that's sort of right at the edge of the Weinviertel, as we call it, just north of Retz. The blue line here is the border, and these are different historical maps showing changes over time. And I think a pretty well-known story is that on the Czech side of the border, over the last sort of 100 years, there's been a sort of homogenization of a lot of the agricultural areas, such that you have much larger contiguous patches, where on the Austrian side, we have this sort of finer mesh of patches, so much smaller fragments, but with generally more consistent land use history on the Austrian side. And so it gives us a nice comparison of different types of regimes for us to leverage. On the north side of this, so the Czech side, the data is actually already colored in with land use estimates from these maps that have been put together by the group at Vukoc. And so this shows, I think, really nicely how these land use patterns have changed through time, and we're hoping to be able to reproduce that effort on the Austrian side to get similar land use change over time maps. All right, and so that's it. Like I said, I'm super excited to talk to anyone who's interested in any of these kinds of methods or theory. Here's my contact info and my research webpage. And in particular, if any of you know methods that might be better at doing what I'm trying to do than what I talked about here, I would be very excited, because I sort of put these together under protest because I couldn't find anything else to do what I wanted to do. And finally, I'd just like to thank a whole bunch of people for this. So in particular, I'd like to thank Zedka and the department here for inviting me for the talk. It's really nice to have a chance to meet you all, even virtually. And I look forward to meeting you in person at some point. And then I have a long list of co-authors and collaborators who helped me put together various pieces of this over the last 2 years. So I'm really grateful to all of them for the time and energy and code and patience that they gave me over this. And with that, I think I will end, and I'm happy to chat about anything anyone's interested in.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Adam, for a very inspiring talk. I think there will be a lot of questions and comments because people here are working with temporal series of permanent plots, so they will really have some ideas. Or so I will ask you, if you have a comment or question, please mark it by this hand and show yourself when you will ask. So yeah, Milan is the first. So
yeah, okay, I promised I will ask afterwards. You showed this example with analysis of previously published data from that Oikos 2011 paper. What kind of data was it?
That was time. Oh, that's actually really, I'm glad you asked that. It's surprisingly short time series data. So these were microcosms that were tracked over the course of a year, but each microcosm was measured 17 times. And over those 17 measurements, they did cell counts. So there's something like 6 or 7 species in those mixtures. I'm only showing results for one of those species, the most common one. But this is 17 observations and I think 8 replicates per treatment. And for each of the treatments, it was various regimes of changing temperatures over time. So I think they all had a sine wave oscillation in temperature, but some of them had jagged changes in temperature and some had smooth changes.
Okay,
but it's important because this meant the total amount of information we had was about, I would say, about 70 sequential observations if you include all the replicates.
So it was a well-controlled system from an experiment. And what about like real world systems? So at the beginning, you showed some time series from the Cedar Creek area. So did you try to apply it to this data or to some other data sets?
I haven't done it yet, but that's exactly the
plan.
The data that I want to use it on. And I've analyzed the Cedar Creek data using just the tokens embeddings before, and those tend to give you quite good predictions of dynamics, but I haven't run it through the whole machinery. The way it is right now is still a bit clunky, so you sort of have to manually build all of the fitting functions for every version you want to use it for. But exactly the hope is to use the Cedar Creek data to use, say, the first 75% of the time series to predict extinction events and then test the outcome using the last 25% of the time series.
And another question, if I may. So you mentioned this story with like Taylor's power law to being invented in ecology, then reinvented by physicists, given a different name. So this is quite common story in ecology. If I think about like log normal distribution of species abundances or species area curves, these are actually more general processes that were discovered in ecology. They were given special names. Ecologists were thinking that they are specific to certain variables, to specific cases, and then it appeared that they are like very general processes that are occurring also in outside world. So now you are developing some methodology, and well, did you look at other fields whether someone is not developing something similar or identical in parallel with you? Because I can imagine such things can be applied very broadly outside of ecology too.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you're right. I should be careful in saying that Taylor is one of the only examples. I think you are probably right that ecology has contributed a lot more to math than maybe most mathematicians would want to admit. But the Kalman-Takens filter that I got from Franz Hamilton is actually a physics model. So as far as I know, it was initially meant to deal with things either electronics data or maybe even particle physics data. And so that's very much borrowed from that field. And as far as I can tell, that's the only version of this that exists. And I would be very happy to learn that there are others. But I think the issue is it's this mix of computers have only been fast enough to do these things for a while, and the Taken stuff isn't that new, but it's only sort of become popular since the last, I would say, 10, 15 years, when a couple groups started publishing a lot on what you can do with those methods. So that's say I haven't been able to find any other applications, but if anyone knows of one, I would be absolutely delighted to learn about it.
Yeah, I don't, sorry, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we have time for next question or comment. Don't see any zoologist.
I always
comment to the prey, and
I feel that in some ways throwing 3 methods in 45 minutes onto a screen is not a very good way to encourage questions. So I do apologize to you all for that.
I think we have to digest the presentation. There were a lot of facts and maths, and we have to think about it carefully.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So, last chance. Yeah. Magda, can you please show yourself to us, and you have your time for question?
My camera, I'm on a different computer, so my camera is being funny, but
okay,
I'm here.
So, yeah, it's. So
but
just ask.
Yeah, thank you. Adam, I have a question. Do you have a sense for how long or how many generations you need to apply these methods to specific systems, say grasslands around the world, maybe?
Yeah, so we're desperately trying to figure that out right now. And I would say the best answer so far has been from Lina Mühlbauer, who's a student who's been helping me with a lot of this. And so one thing that you can do, this is mostly an answer for how you know whether or not it's working, is that you can just look at the result from the Takens embedding itself before you do any of this other magic, and look at how good your predictive ability is for the data. And if it's very low, that probably means that this isn't going to work very well. And basically what happens is, as that prediction from this Takens embedding thing gets worse and worse, you're able to explain less and less of the deterministic dynamics, and you basically shunt that variation over to the process noise function. And so it seems you're still able to do a pretty good job predicting extinction events, but basically you just end up with less variability in the predicted abundances and more variability in the process noise function. And so we're hopeful that even with pretty bad embeddings, you can still predict time to extinction. So that's how you would test this performance. Sort of rule of thumb is that for a lot of time series, having about 30 sequential observations is a pretty good start. And by that, I actually don't mean that you need 30 years of data, because you can also pool across replicates. So you could, for example, have 5 sequential observations in each of 6 plots. And often that gives you about the same amount of data that you would have from having 30 sequential observations in one plot. Now, actually, if this is of interest, there's a paper in Ecology that I did maybe 6 years ago, which explores this for the Takens embedding stuff for different data set lengths and structures and things like that to show when you tend to get good performance of the method. But so I don't know if that actually answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so Felicia is prepared with her question. Yeah, Felicia. Felicia, your microphone.
Sorry, now I realized. Sorry. Thank you, Adam, for the nice talk. I think when Zdenka mentioned people working with time series, she was talking about me.
Not exactly, but yeah, you are one of them.
Yeah. And it was a bit hard for me to think, because most of your models, you are dealing with one species or this like predator prey. So how could we put these models into like the whole community?
Mm-hmm.
And if we could do something like substitute the predator prey for something like climate and species responding to climate.
Oh, that's such a good question. Yes. So so the short answer, the easiest thing you can do is just take each species in isolation. And that's one advantage from this Takens method, is that at least in theory, you ought to be able, even if it's a system with 100 species in it, you should still be able to predict the dynamics of a single species based on only its own historical behavior. But that's, of course, in theory. In practice, it goes much better usually if you include information from other species. And so there's a nice set of papers from Hao Yi. He's one of the people I have cited here, but he's also on the ecology paper I mentioned. So you should be able to find him through my website. Or if you want, I can send you the paper I'm thinking of here. But he's done a lot of work on multivariate embedding. And so there, like you said, you include the abundance of multiple species at once, or even you could include covariates like temperature or precipitation as additional axes in your embedding. So effectively, you end up replacing a time-lagged observation with an observation of a species or a climate variable. Where you can get into trouble is that these methods don't work very well for extrapolation. And so let's say you have a warming trend. This method is going to tell you what future dynamics would look like if they were to be consistent with past dynamics. And so if you start having temperature regimes that you've never seen before, it's not clear this method will perform very well. In practice, though, here I'm actually using a slightly different algorithm based on something called S-mapping, where in the classic version, you literally are just matching historical trends and using that to predict your next one. Here, you're actually fitting a bunch of local regressions based on past data. And if you're lucky, you'll often actually be able to do some extrapolations, because it will show something like the average growth rate seems to decline linearly with temperature or something like that. And then you can try to forecast that forward. And a neat example of someone doing that, I think that'll also be on my website, is a paper that is estimating interaction strengths among different species and microcosms by Janan Karakoc. And in that one, it effectively used this S-mapping routine to try to estimate how these interaction strengths were changing through time. And that's the method that you can also use to say, for example, what is the effect of temperature dynamics on my growth dynamics and things like that. And so I think that's a paper in Ecology Letters from last year.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a look.
Adam, I edit the paper from Ecology to the chat. Maybe just have a look if I edited the correct paper.
Exactly that one. Oh, and that's actually, and I suppose I could even be polite and put Janan's paper into the chat.
Yeah, it's just for people who are curious for that.
Exactly. We take advantages that come from digital formats.
Yeah, they are awesome. So, another questions? Yeah, Milano.
So if there are no other questions, I will ask again. So regarding this plant project with land use and biodiversity in the comparison of Czech and Austrian landscapes, Do you want to interpret past changes, or do you also plan to make predictions for the future? Like for example, yeah, you will have data on the dynamics of land use change in the landscape. Whether you are intending to extend it to the future, I don't think it's possible because it's influenced by external forces, by social economics. So what's the plan regarding this project?
I think for the grant application, we were pretty conservative and limited it to just discussing past trends. I think though I would want to force ourselves to make predictions where we at least said, if the current trends in land use change were to continue, here's what we guess will happen. Just because I think for any method that's this complicated, I think it's important to put out a prediction that can be wrong, just so that if in 10 years it turns out to be 100% completely, totally, stupidly wrong, then we at least know to stop using it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, certainly I want to do predictions. I don't think we've told anyone yet that we're going to do predictions.
Yes, of course, predictions are what like general public asks from ecologists, and we are not able to make predictions, or we make different wrong predictions. But like prediction related to land use change, I think it will be really challenging because it was always influenced by some abrupt socio-economic change. So we had one such change after World War II, then after 1989. And in each of these periods, the landscape developed in a different way. So maybe we can make predictions based on the land use change from the past 30 years, which for which you don't have these data from WUCOTS, but there are satellite data which can replace it. And I think the trends over the past 30 years that could be observed from remote sensing could be maybe extrapolated to the future, but not the earlier dynamics.
No, for example, I live here in a pretty small farming community that my family's been in for something like 60 years now, and I know for sure that the land use changes here have changed basically every 5 years because of the EU regulations and how they vary. And so when I was a child, every field here was corn, and now every field here is pasture, because the local farmers can make more money off of selling fodder than they can off of selling corn. And so I totally agree with you that I think in some ways, trying to predict what's going to happen to the landscape in 5 years is going to be hard. But I like the idea, because I think that Peter had suggested that we use some of the data, I think from Corine, it's called, these reconstructions.
That's it, yes.
And I think that would be super exciting to try to use that to at least make some short-term forecasts for what we think is going to happen to the landscapes.
Good.
Okay. So I guess we will close this presentation. Adam, once again, many thanks. It was really wonderful. And I hope that in the future we will welcome you personally.
Yes, and I should say, for when travel is possible again, any of you who would like to come out here are more than welcome. It would be very exciting to host you out in Graz. And like you said, it is just a train ride away.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was really a lot of fun.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank to all of you. And the next week we will have a presentation also in English, but it will be Czech lady Anna Bucharova. Now she's working in Minster. She's working with species traits. So we will move to functional ecology